Usually when we talk about understanding reality, there's this expectation of absolute precision. We treat existence like it's this, mechanical engineering problem.
It's something you can just measure.
Exactly, like you break your arm, right?
Yeah.
The X-ray shows that jagged white line on the radius bone, and the doctor just points at the screen and says, there it is, there's the break. We expect the universe to offer us that same level of diagnostic clarity.
I mean, it's a comforting paradigm, isn't it? We're fundamentally wired to uh, categorize phenomena into these neat, observable boxes, binary states,
Yeah.
like broken or not broken, existing or not existing.
But the moment you step into the realm of ancient ontology, specifically the ultimate fate of human consciousness and the nature of the self, that X-ray machine just suddenly shorts
It
out.
completely breaks down.
It does. And today we are looking at a set of notes, specifically a really nuanced draft text called Chapter 5 of Sunyo.pdf. And this text completely dismantles the diagnostic tools we use to understand our own existence. We're diving into this incredibly contentious philosophical battleground of cessation versus annihilationism.
Oh, and it is a debate that has raged for thousands of years. I mean, it centers on one of the most provocative questions ever asked.
Which is what, exactly?
Well, what actually happens when a fully enlightened being dies? Do they transition into some radiant, ineffable realm? Or is their existence simply extinguished?
Extinguished,
Yeah.
just gone. And, for you listening, the reason we are doing this custom-tailored deep dive into these specific source materials isn't just to, split hairs over ancient Pali grammar.
No, not at all.
It's because untangling this concept of cessation, which is the ending of the cycle of rebirth, untangling that from annihilationism, which is this bleak, violent erasure of a soul, it forces a complete reframing of what you actually fear losing when you think about death.
It really does. It exposes the massive hidden assumptions that are just operating in our minds every single second of the day.
And visually, I see we are already reflecting the shift in our virtual space here. We're sitting in this sprawling, dimly lit, kind of dusty library, but the ceiling has just opened up into this complete starry void.
It's a gorgeous visual representation of the topic.
Right. So, jumping right into the deep end, the source text anchors this entire debate in the ancient Indian philosophical ecosystem. It specifically references a foundational discourse called the Kakanagata Sutta.
Right. A very pivotal text.
And this text outlines the prevailing wrong views of the era. So on one side you have eternalism, which is the idea that some core essence of you survives forever.
Like a soul.
Exactly. And on the other side, you've got annihilationism, which is the materialist view that you die, the body rots, and it is entirely lights out.
And the overarching narrative we are often taught is that the Buddha introduced a middle view to sort of navigate between those two extremes.
Right.
But the author of our source document brings up a fascinating complication here, a philosophical loophole, really, that early readers of his draft actually pointed out to him.
Yeah, the loophole of the delayed ending. I love this part. So if I believe in reincarnation, and I think that my soul gets reborn, say, 10,000 times, but eventually, at the very end of all those cycles, my soul gets completely wiped out into nothingness. Where does that leave me?
It's a fantastic question.
Right, because I am technically rejecting eternalism because my soul doesn't last forever, but I'm also technically rejecting immediate materialist annihilationism because I survived this current death. So by standard logic, I should be holding the middle view, shouldn't I?
It is a phenomenal question because it really demands that we define our terms with surgical precision. The author clarifies that the ancient term for non-survival or annihilationism, the Pali word is natita, was highly specific to the materialist philosophy of ancient India.
Okay, meaning what?
It meant one-life annihilationism, like the absolute conviction that consciousness is just a byproduct of physical elements, and when the physical body dies, the entity is gone forever.
So this multiple lifetime annihilation view just falls completely off the map. It evades the established binary entirely.
It does. But, we have to abandon the modern fallacy that simply avoiding two extreme positions automatically guarantees you have found the truth.
Oh, that's a good point.
It's a really common cognitive trap to assume the golden mean is inherently correct. The text brings up the equivocators, or the agnostics of ancient India.
The ones who just wouldn't commit.
Right. When asked about the afterlife, they would say, I don't say it is like this, I don't say it is like that, I don't deny it. They successfully avoided both survival and non-survival. Yet, in the context of the Kakanagata Sutta, they are still fundamentally trapped in wrong view.
Let me push back on that, though, because I know people listening might be wondering this. If the goal is to not hold an incorrect view, and the agnostic refuses to hold any view at all, aren't they technically succeeding?
Well, they're succeeding at evasion, not comprehension.
Ah.
Their view is rooted in confusion and an inability to perceive the actual mechanisms of reality. Avoiding an error is not the same thing as acquiring insight.
Okay, that makes total sense. It's like being stranded in a desert. You know drinking venom will kill you, so you avoid it. But you also refuse to drink the water from your canteen because you aren't sure if it's safe.
That's a great analogy.
Right. Like, you avoided the fatal action, but you are still missing the active mechanism required for survival. Just avoiding the wrong thing isn't a strategy for living.
That captures the dynamic perfectly. The middle view is not a compromise or just a process of elimination. It requires an active, radical shift in epistemological understanding.
So it's an act of realization.
Exactly. The text emphasizes that true right view requires the active knowledge that only suffering arises and ceases, not a self.
I really want to hover on that phrase, because that seems to be the mechanism that breaks the entire paradox. Only suffering arises and ceases, not a self. So the person holding that multiple lifetime annihilation view is still operating under the delusion that there is an I, like a passenger, riding the train of reincarnation until the train crashes.
Precisely. They still possess an ontology of a self. The middle view cuts the root of that assumption entirely. It redefines the parameters of existence by stating there is no passenger to begin with.
It's just the train.
There is only the motion of the train. There is only a causally linked process of suffering arising and a causally linked process of suffering ceasing.
Which fundamentally alters the vocabulary we have to use to even discuss this stuff. I mean, the source moves into this fascinating linguistic territory, next what we might call the grammar of existence.
The language is so tricky here.
It is. It notes that both the ancient materialists and the early Buddhists were utilizing the exact same terminology to describe their ultimate goals. Words like ucheta for annihilation and vibhava for eradication.
Right.
So if you were just a casual observer hanging around in ancient India, you would hear these two rival camps using the exact same catchphrases.
You would. But context defines the lexicon. When a materialist used the word eradication, they were asserting the destruction of an entity.
A real thing.
Right. They believed in a solid, independently existing ego, a me, that was going to be violently smashed into non-existence at the termination of the physical body.
But the Buddha was essentially performing semantic hijacking here. He took their favored terms and just inverted the underlying target.
He absolutely did.
When he spoke of annihilation, he wasn't talking about murdering an entity. He was talking about the annihilation of defilements, like the psychological drives of greed, hatred, and delusion, or the eradication of selfless, impersonal processes.
The text highlights an incredibly subtle yet universally profound linguistic shift that demonstrates this beautifully. The popular materialist mantra of the time, the meditation they would recite was, I might not exist and it might not exist for me. I will not exist and it will not exist for me.
It's dripping with ego. It is entirely first-person oriented. I will not exist.
Right, the focus is entirely on the self. But the Buddha adapted this meditation for his own monastics, and he altered the grammar to the third person.
Oh, this is the flip.
Yes. He instructed them to reflect. It might not exist, and it might not exist for me. It will not exist, and it will not exist for me.
Shifting from I to it is not just a grammatical correction, though. That is a neurological intervention.
How do you mean?
Well, if I am sitting here contemplating I will not exist, my brain interprets that as an imminent lethal threat. The amygdala fires up. Existential dread just floods the system because the biological imperative is to protect the I. The assumption is that the I is a tangible, valuable object that is about to be stolen from me.
Absolutely. Because the unlearned mind cannot differentiate between the awareness of a process and the ownership of a process.
Exactly. But if you actually observe the mechanics of your own mind and realize that what you call you is just this rapid-fire sequence of physical sensations, temporary feelings, and fleeting thoughts, what the texts refer to as selfless aggregates, then the threat just vanishes. It will not exist.
The source offers a deeply pragmatic analogy here to help visualize this. Imagine a neighbor who owns a massive, overpowering stereo system.
Oh, I've had that neighbor.
We all have. And they are blasting a chaotic, discordant song on a continuous loop, day and night.
Just constant noise.
Constant noise. And when they finally unplug the machine, what has actually been destroyed.
Nothing tangible. I mean, no entity was annihilated.
Yeah.
A dependent process electricity flowing through wires to vibrate a speaker cone simply ceased functioning.
Exactly. The song of existence, which is driven by the electricity of craving, just stops. That is the definition of cessation.
But the psychological disparity in how this is received is staggering. The text contrasts the reaction of the unlearned ordinary person with the noble one.
The reactions couldn't be more different.
Right. Even if you explain the stereo analogy perfectly to the unlearned person, their deep-seated cognitive bias toward a self triggers absolute panic. The texts describe them literally weeping and beating their chests, crying out, "I will be destroyed."
Because they conflate the cessation of the noise with the murder of the listener.
That is such a powerful way to put it.
They are so thoroughly entangled with their consciousness and their physical form that the cessation of those aggregates is processed as a personal execution.
Whereas the noble ones, the minds that have seen through the illusion, they experience zero fear. You cannot mourn the loss of something that never existed in the first place. It is just the discordant music finally turning off.
And this internal friction over the definition of the self, it leads us directly into one of the most revealing historical narratives in the source text. I'm talking about the incident with the monk Yamaka.
Oh, the Yamaka incident.
Yeah, because this wasn't just a misunderstanding limited to rival philosophical schools outside the group. This confusion was actively infecting the internal monastic community.
I found the Yamaka narrative incredibly compelling because it feels so modern to me. You have this monk, Yamaka, who basically goes rogue. He starts preaching to anyone who will listen, claiming he has finally decoded the ultimate teaching.
He's very confident.
Super confident. He states, when a truth finder, an enlightened being dies, they're completely annihilated and destroyed.
And his peers are understandably alarmed by this. They try to correct his misrepresentation, but Yamaka is deeply entrenched in his view. He simply refuses to concede.
So they have to bring in the big guns.
They do. This necessitates an intervention by Venerable Sariputta, who essentially serves as the intellectual heavyweight of the community.
And Sariputta doesn't just reprimand him, which is what I love. He acts like a software debugger. He isolates every single line of code in Yamaka's mental framework until the fatal error is exposed. Could you walk us through the architecture of Sariputta's Socratic takedown?
I'd love to. So Sariputta begins by establishing a baseline agreement on the mechanics of human experience, breaking it down into the 5 aggregates: form, feeling, perception, will, and consciousness.
Okay, the basics.
Right. And he asks Yamaka a series of rapid-fire questions. He says, is form permanent or impermanent? Yamaka replies, impermanent.
Makes sense.
And what is impermanent a source of happiness or suffering? Yamaka says, suffering. Sariputta then asks, is it epistemologically sound to regard something that is impermanent and inherently unsatisfactory as myself? And Yamaka is forced by his own logic to concede, no.
So he traps him in the fundamental mechanics first. He gets him to agree to the ground rules.
Exactly. Then Sariputta narrows the parameters. He asks, can you locate a truth finder, a truly existing entity inside the physical form, the feelings, the perceptions, the will, or the consciousness? Yamaka answers, no.
Because none of those individual things are a self.
Right. So then Sariputta asks, can you locate a truth finder anywhere outside of those 5 aggregates? No. Do you consider the truth finder to be a combination of them, or perhaps an entity that possesses none of them? To every single configuration, Yamaka must answer, no.
It's brilliant. Sariputta systematically dismantles every single hiding place where the human ego tries to stash a soul.
And then the logical trap springs shut. Sariputta delivers the final inquiry. Yamaka, since no truth finder is found by you to actually truly exist even during this very life, is it philosophically coherent for you to assert that an undefiled mendicant gets annihilated and destroyed when their physical body breaks down?
Oh, it's such a mic drop moment. If the entity cannot be proven to exist while the heart is beating and the lungs are breathing, how can you claim that entity is murdered when the breathing stops? You cannot assassinate a phantom.
You really can't.
But, okay, let me play devil's advocate here for a second, because if I am Yamaka, I might feel a bit cheated by this semantic maneuvering.
I'll say.
Well, why didn't Sariputta just use conventional truth? Why not simply say, Yamaka, you are confused? The truth finder isn't annihilated, it's just that the 5 aggregates break apart and don't reform. Why do this whole exhaustive Socratic runaround?
That is a critical observation, and it cuts to the core of ancient Indian semantics. Sariputta couldn't use that framing because the very word truth finder Tathagata in the Pali language carried immense, inescapable ontological baggage.
Baggage like what?
Well, in the broader religious landscape of the time, that word did not mean a temporary collection of selfless aggregates. It was practically synonymous with a soul, a permanent transcendent essence.
Ah. So if Sariputta had conceded the linguistic ground and just said, the truth finder ceases, Yamaka's brain would have automatically translated that to, the soul is destroyed.
Precisely. Attempting to redefine a heavily loaded cultural term on the fly is rarely successful. Sariputta had to reject the foundational premise of the question itself.
He had to dig out the root.
He had to force Yamaka to admit that the thing he was so worried about being annihilated never had ontological reality to begin with.
And this friction over what the Buddha was actually denying brings us to what might be the most fiercely debated, heavily scrutinized quote in all of early Buddhist scholarship. The famous line from the Simile of the Cobra Discourse. Can you set the historical stage for this moment for us?
Sure. So the Buddha is addressing his disciples,
Hmm.
and he's noting that rival religious leaders are actively slandering him in the public square.
Like ancient smear campaigns.
Exactly. They're accusing him of being a nihilist, of teaching the total annihilation of an existing being. So to refute this, the Buddha states, "In the past and also now, I assert only suffering and a cessation of suffering."
I assert only suffering and a cessation of suffering. I mean, on the surface, that sounds like a very straightforward mission statement. Why does that specific sentence cause such a massive rift in modern scholarship?
The controversy really stems from how modern academics and certain contemporary Buddhist traditions choose to interpret the scope of that statement. A very prominent school of thought interprets that line through a purely pragmatic lens. They argue the Buddha is essentially saying, listen, I am not interested in metaphysical debates about what happens after death. My only curriculum is suffering and the tools to stop it. I simply refuse to discuss the rest.
So they kind of reduce his role to that of a psychological technician, as if he is saying, don't worry about the fundamental nature of the cosmos, just do your breathwork exercises and reduce your stress.
Exactly. However, the author of our source text vigorously disputes this pragmatic reductionism. He cites extensive contextual evidence to argue that this was not a deflection at all.
It wasn't just him dodging the question.
No, it was a rigorous, direct, ontological refutation of the annihilationist charge.
So he is answering the question by redefining the parameters of reality itself.
Yes. When the accusers claim, you teach the destruction of a self, the Buddha is not saying, I don't care about the self. He is saying, I cannot possibly teach the destruction of a self, because a self fundamentally does not exist. The only phenomena that possess reality are the processes of suffering. Therefore, the only thing that can conceptually cease is suffering.
I love that. It's like if someone accuses you of embezzling funds from a company that literally does not exist, you don't respond by saying, I only care about my personal bank account. You say, the corporation is a fiction, therefore the crime is an impossibility.
That is a very apt modern translation of the dynamic. And this leads into a substantial academic dispute the author has with other modern scholars, most notably Bhikkhu Analayo.
Right. The text spends some time on this.
It does. Analayo proposes that if the Buddha truly intended to teach that the death of an enlightened being results in complete remainderless cessation like a true ending, he would have explicitly used terms denoting blank nothingness.
And because he didn't use those words.
Because the Buddha doesn't use those specific descriptors, Analayo infers that some state of utter transcendence or profound, ineffable awareness must persist after death.
And the source text just takes a sledgehammer to that logic. I mean, the author utilizes the argument from silence, but flips it to prove the exact opposite.
How so? Walk us through his logic.
Well, if the Buddha actually believed in or had experienced some eternal, transcendent, luminous state that remains after death, it would have been the easiest thing in the world to silence his critics.
Oh, absolutely.
When they called him an annihilationist, he could have effortlessly replied, you misunderstand. You don't get wiped out. There is a boundless, transcendent consciousness waiting for you.
He could have instantly neutralized the primary criticism against his entire philosophy.
But he never does. Not once in the thousands of pages of the early canon does he offer that consolation prize. His silence regarding any form of post-mortem continuation isn't just a refusal to answer. It is epistemological proof. He didn't teach continuation because there is no continuation to teach.
The rigor of that stance is staggering. But, theory must eventually meet practice. The source transitions from these dense ontological arguments into the lived experience of these concepts. It highlights the story of an enlightened monk named Adhimutta.
Oh, Adhimuta's narrative is amazing. It provides the emotional anchor for all this abstract logic.
Hmm.
So he's wandering alone and is captured by a violent band of outlaws or forest bandits.
A really dangerous situation.
Incredibly dangerous. They intend to execute him, likely as a blood sacrifice. Now, the bandit chief expects the usual reaction, right? Begging, weeping, physiological panic. But instead, he looks at Adhimuta and is completely unnerved because the monk is absolutely, unshakably serene.
The chief is so bewildered, he actually pauses the execution to ask him about it. He says, "Everyone else we kill squeals and trembles. Why don't you grieve in such a frightful situation?"
And Adhimuta responds with a series of verses that perfectly encapsulate that shift from I to it that we talked about earlier. He describes physical existence as a heavy, rotting burden or a chronic disease.
He doesn't romanticize it at all.
Not even a little. He views death not as a tragic theft of life, but as the simple act of putting down a burden you've been forced to carry. He looks this warlord in the eye and says, only produced things will be eradicated. Why mourn over that?
Notice the precise terminology there. Only produced things. He does not conceptualize his impending murder as I am being eradicated.
Right.
He perceives his biological form and his conscious awareness as manufactured phenomena that have simply reached the end of their conditional lifespan.
It is the absolute zenith of detachment. And the source links Adhimuta's psychological state to one of the most famous metaphors in the early texts. The world as grass and wood, which was delivered in the Jada Grove.
The Jada Grove metaphor perfectly illustrates the mechanism of ownership and suffering. So the Buddha is walking through this wooded area with his disciples, and he poses a hypothetical scenario.
Setting a scene.
Right. He asks, if people were to come into this grove and gather up all the fallen leaves, the dried twigs, the dead branches, and set them on fire,
Yeah.
would you feel as though you were being burned?
And the monks, just relying on basic common sense, reply, no, those leaves are not us. They are not a part of our bodies. We don't own them.
The Buddha then delivers the cognitive pivot. In the exact same way, the physical body, your feelings, your perceptions, your will, your consciousness, none of these are yours. They are merely the grass and wood of the world. Abandon your instinct to claim them as mine, and it will lead to your long-term welfare.
If you take a second and actually run that software program in your own mind today, the implications are just staggering. Think about a moment of acute suffering,
Like what?
like a debilitating migraine or a sudden spike of social anxiety, or maybe a moment where your professional pride is deeply wounded. Our immediate involuntary reflex is to claim ownership. My head is in agony. My anxiety is ruining this event. My pride is damaged. We fuse our identity to the pain.
We invite the burning leaves into our own house.
Exactly. We pull them right into the living room and wonder why it's getting hot. But if you could genuinely perceive that spite of anxiety, where you perceive a pile of dry leaves blowing across a sidewalk, you acknowledge it exists, you observe its movement, but you do not claim it as mine.
It's just a phenomenon.
It is just a temporary produced event arising from causes and conditions. If we severed that link of ownership, the psychological suffering layered on top of the physical reality would just evaporate.
And you would achieve the state of Adhimutta. You could face the literal destruction of your physical form and recognize it merely as the burning of leaves.
Which brings us to the most confronting, difficult terrain of this entire philosophical exploration.
Really big question.
The big question. Because we have to look directly at the ultimate outcome. If the leaves are burned, if the aggregates break apart and do not reform, and if there is no underlying self to survive the process,
Well,
is Nibbana, is final extinguishment, just a terrifying void of blank nothingness?
to really unpack this, we have to look closely at the mechanics of the terminology. The word Nibbana, or nirvana, as most people know, it literally translates to the going out of a fire. The source makes a vital distinction that this extinguishment occurs in two distinct sequential stages.
Okay, so stage one occurs during the biological life of the practitioner.
Yes, this is the moment of enlightenment.
Yeah.
This is the extinguishing of the fire of the defilements. The fuel of greed, hatred, and ignorance is entirely consumed.
But the person is still there.
Right, the human being continues to walk, communicate, and digest food. But the psychological fires that drive future rebirth are out.
In the final stage.
The final stage occurs at the precise moment of physical death. This is the extinguishing of the fire of existence itself. The physical and mental aggregates cease, and lacking the fuel of craving, they do not re-arise. So the philosophical crisis becomes, does this ultimate cessation possess an ontology?
Does it exist as a tangible destination or a state of being? And this is where our cognitive architecture and our language just utterly betray us. We are desperate for cessation to function as a noun, a location on a map, a room we can walk into. The source utilizes a highly effective modern analogy to break this habit. The computer's off state.
I think the off state is an excellent tool to bypass our linguistic biases here. A laptop functions through various active processes, right?
Right.
Running algorithms, displaying pixels, emitting audio. But it also possesses an off state.
Right.
Is that off state a physical substance? Does it reside on the motherboard?
Of course not. It is simply the total absence of the computer processing electricity.
The text also references Herr Varman, an ancient philosopher from a school deeply aligned with these early teachings. He offered the analogy of cutting down a tree.
Okay, how does that work?
Well, the action of cutting down the tree is a reality. It is an event that occurs. However, the cutting down is not a physical object. You cannot place the cutting down in a box and hand it to someone.
Wow. Extinguishment, therefore, operates as a possibility or a definitive end state of a process, not as an ontological substance or a mystical realm of dark matter.
But this introduces a massive contradiction that many readers encounter when they study these texts. If cessation is merely the ending of a process, why do so many translated texts speak of realizing the unborn or entering the deathless?
Yeah, that terminology is everywhere.
And these terms are frequently capitalized in English literature, which lends them immense mystical gravitas.
It makes it sound like you are accessing an eternal glowing orb of divine energy. He entered the unborn. It sounds like an acquisition of something incredibly profound.
The author meticulously dismantles this as the translation trap. The original Pali term, frequently rendered as the unborn, is ajata. If we examine the philological roots, the prefix a simply denotes without or un.
Kind of like how asymmetrical means without symmetry.
Exactly. Therefore, ajata translates cleanly to without birth or the cessation of birth.
So it is an adjective describing a negative state, not a proper noun denoting a place.
Precisely. However, Victorian-era translators, who were often carrying the baggage of Western theological or transcendentalist frameworks, translated these adjectives into capitalized nouns. The unborn, the uncreated.
Oh, that changes the meaning entirely.
They inadvertently transformed the description of a process stopping into a mystical, eternal reality. The early texts frequently employ epiphatic theology, which is the method of describing something by explicitly stating what it is not.
Like if I say, I am without hunger, I am describing the cessation of a biological drive. I have not acquired a magical, invisible object called the unhunger that I now carry around with me.
That's a perfect example. The text declares Nibbana is without birth, without sickness, without death. It is the definitive termination of those cycles, not a celestial waiting room where you exist in a state of unbirth.
The author references a brilliant moment from Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland to illustrate why the human brain constantly makes this error.
I love this part.
It's so good. So Alice is gazing down a path and remarks to the king, I see nobody on the road. And the king, who is trapped in literalism, becomes envious and declares, I wish I had eyes good enough to see nobody, and at that distance too.
It perfectly isolates the cognitive glitch of reification. We take a linguistic placeholder that denotes an absence like nobody or nothingness, and our brains automatically solidify it into a something. We turn the absence of existence into a spooky, invisible substance.
So when ancient verses say there is a sphere where there is nothing, they aren't describing a cosmological void made of antimatter. They are issuing a straightforward statement, all processes stop here.
Exactly.
But if I play the skeptic again, if there is no destination, if Nibbana isn't a realm of profound bliss, why would anyone subject themselves to decades of monastic discipline just to achieve the equivalent of turning off a computer? How is this not just a very slow, complicated form of psychological suicide?
There's the most common and potent criticism, but it relies on the flawed assumption we dismantled in the very first segment.
About this.
Yes. Suicide is the desire to destroy an existing entity because you hate the entity or the pain it is experiencing. Cessation is the profound realization that the entity never existed, and the subsequent choice to unplug the malfunctioning stereo that is endlessly broadcasting the noise of suffering.
Wow.
One is an act of violent delusion, the other is the ultimate act of clarity.
Which perfectly sets up our final philosophical hurdle here, because if Nibbana isn't a thing, and it's not a mystical realm of the unborn, why is it almost universally described in modern spiritual circles as ineffable or beyond words?
Well, the concept of the ineffable is deeply romanticized. We are drawn to the idea of a spiritual state that is so overwhelmingly transcendent, so dazzlingly complex, that our primitive human vocabulary simply short-circuit trying to describe it.
We love the aesthetic of the indescribable mystery.
We really do. But the source text applies relentless logic to shatter that romanticism. Nibbana is not ineffable because it is a glowing, transcendental super-reality that exceeds our cognitive bandwidth. It is ineffable because there's literally no data left to describe.
Oh, that is wild.
If the aggregates of form, feeling, perception, and consciousness have entirely ceased, what phenomenal experience remains to be articulated? The source references a striking passage from the Udana, an early text that compares the final passing of an enlightened being to a glowing spark struck from a blacksmith's anvil.
Okay.
The spark arcs through the air, its heat and light gradually fade, and it simply goes out. What is the precise destination of that faded spark?
You cannot map the coordinates of its destination because it didn't travel anywhere. The heat just dissipated. The process ended.
Exactly. You cannot describe the destination of the spark, not because the destination exists in a dimension beyond human language, but because the destination is a non-reality.
Our master logician, Sariputta, actually established the epistemological boundaries for this exact problem, didn't he? He stated that elaboration, the Pali concept of papanyaka, which refers to the proliferation of concepts, language, and mental constructs, only extends to the absolute limits of the six senses: sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and the mind.
The senses are the absolute boundary of human epistemology.
Right. So if you attempt to formulate a description of a state after the mechanisms of perception have permanently shut down, you are violating the basic laws of reality.
You're trying to measure something that isn't there.
It's like you are trying to use a thermometer to measure the weight of a thought. The instrument is fundamentally incompatible with the task.
And when later traditions argue that nibbana must be a state of unwavering, subtle bliss that persists after the breakup of the body, they are engaging in unauthorized elaboration. They are essentially inventing a hypothetical seventh sense to experience a post-mortem state. The early texts explicitly prohibit this conceptual overreach.
The author provides a deeply relatable analogy regarding the limits of language anyway, utilizing the simple act of tasting food.
The phenomenology of the everyday.
Consider the act of eating an orange. Try to describe the precise physical sensation of the citric acid hitting your taste buds to someone who has never encountered citrus.
It's impossible.
You can employ adjectives sweet, acidic, bright, but the actual direct physical experience is fundamentally beyond the reach of language. Technically speaking, eating an orange is an ineffable event. Words are merely pointers. They can never fully capture the texture of reality.
Therefore, applying the label ineffable to nibbana does not automatically elevate it to the status of a mystical, transcendent realm. It merely categorizes it alongside every other direct reality that linguistic frameworks fail to encapsulate.
So the argument that nibbana must be a transcendent something because we can't describe it completely collapses. To the noble ones, the enlightened minds who have directly experienced the cessation of the defilements, it is not an inscrutable mystery. They possess perfect clarity regarding what has occurred.
It is only a mystery, an ineffable paradox to the unlearned ordinary person. A person who is still deeply entangled in the illusion of a solid self, and who is frantically trying to mentally simulate what it feels like to not exist.
They are desperately trying to imagine the taste of the orange while simultaneously experiencing profound terror that the orange is going to assassinate them. It is a massive cognitive knot.
That's a great way to put it.
Well, we have traversed some incredibly dense, challenging philosophical terrain today in this deep dive. We began by untangling the middle view, realizing that simply avoiding the extremes of eternal survival and materialist annihilation isn't sufficient. True understanding requires the paradigm shift that only impersonal suffering arises and ceases.
And we explored the grammar of existence, noting how the Buddha defanged the terror of annihilation by shifting the perspective from a fragile I to an objective it.
We observed Sariputta logically dismantling the concept of the truth finder, proving that you cannot destroy an entity after death if that entity cannot be proven to exist during life.
We decoded the translation traps that turned the cessation of processes into mystical nouns like the unborn, and we demystified the concept of the ineffable.
The ultimate question, of course, is why any of this ancient, rigorous analysis matters to your life today. And, it matters because within this exactingly precise philosophy lies the blueprint for ultimate psychological freedom.
It really does.
If there is no permanent, unchanging self hidden inside your neurochemistry, then you are released from the exhausting lifelong burden of defending it.
You no longer have to perceive every insult, every physical pain, every failure as a direct assault on your core identity. You don't have to fear the fading of the spark because you realize the spark was never you to begin with. It removes the baseline hum of existential terror from the human experience.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to explore on your own, a way to synthesize the magnitude of what we've unpacked today. Think back to the most profound, overwhelming sense of relief you have ever experienced in your life.
Okay.
Perhaps you were trapped in a uniquely terrifying, incredibly vivid nightmare. You were being pursued, you were trapped, you were in imminent, lethal danger. The fear was absolute. And then, your eyes snap open.
You wake up.
You see the ceiling of your bedroom. The physiological panic is still fading, but the realization hits you with absolute clarity. None of it was real. The threat wasn't real. The environment wasn't real.
Right.
If this ancient philosophy is accurate, and the self, this ego we defend with such fierce, desperate intensity, is merely the architecture of the nightmare we are currently dreaming, then the final cessation we have spent this time discussing is not the tragic, violent death of the dreamer. It is simply the profound, unshakable peace of the waking room, a place where the dream no longer requires the energy to exist. What would your daily experience look like, starting right now, if you stopped fighting so desperately to keep the dream alive?
It changes everything.
We started today talking about the comfort of the X-ray machine, the desire to find the clean break, to locate the solid thing we can point to and say, there I am. Perhaps the ultimate relief isn't finding the fracture. Perhaps the ultimate relief is realizing that when you finally look at the X-ray of the universe, the screen is entirely empty, and it was never broken to begin with.